Welcome to another episode on the Real Crime Reports channel, where we delve into the most chilling and complex criminal cases. Today, we bring you the disturbing story of a forbidden teacher-student affair that ended in tragedy. This is the tale of a 19-year-old student and her 50-year-old teacher, a relationship that seemed innocent at first but quickly spiraled into obsession, manipulation, and murder. How far can a forbidden love go before it destroys everything? Join us as we uncover the shocking details behind this tragic and fatal affair. Jenny was 19 years old when she entered a world she could never have imagined. She was ambitious, intelligent, and had big dreams. Jenny knew she wanted to achieve more than most of those around her. While many of her friends were preoccupied with typical life goals, she was searching for something that would give her a sense of control and purpose. She wanted to prove herself, be independent, and find a way out of the small world she lived in. Despite her ambitions, Jenny often felt lonely and misunderstood. Although she was popular and respected at school, she never truly felt like she belonged. She wasn't a typical member of a solid group, but rather someone who connected with certain people at specific moments. Jenny longed for attention and recognition, but at the same time, she was cautious about who she trusted. Her closest friends were few, but they were incredibly important to her. She was always searching for something more, a bigger purpose, but what she ultimately found was more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Jenny spent her days mainly focused on school and preparing for her future. Her routine was structured: school in the mornings, afternoons spent in the library or working on projects. Free time and parties were rarely on her agenda. Her goals were clear. She wanted to break free from the confines of her small town and achieve something more. But despite her ambition, she often felt empty and was searching for validation. School was familiar territory for Jenny. She was good at her subjects and knew how to position herself in the group without drawing attention. But one ordinary autumn morning, her routine changed. It was the day the new history teacher, Mr. Harris, stood before the class. Mr. Harris had a calm but impressive presence. He spoke with an authority that immediately captured the attention of the students. While her classmates seemed uninterested, Jenny listened intently. It was the way he led the classroom, quietly and confidently, creating a sense of trust. She realized he was different from the other teachers. It wasn't just the topics he taught, but also the way he conveyed them. He told stories that came to life and connected them to his own experiences. Jenny found herself drawn to him, not only because of his knowledge, but also due to the way he interacted with the students. After class, Jenny increasingly sought out conversations with Mr. Harris. Initially, it was just to clarify things from the lessons, but soon it became more than just academic discussions. She looked forward to these moments and began incorporating them into her daily routine after the rest of the class had left the room. It was an opportunity to talk about more than just the course material, and she started to truly appreciate these conversations. Mr. Harris had a quiet authority that drew Jenny in. He told stories that brought history to life and often spoke of his own experiences and the many places he had visited. Jenny listened intently and asked questions that went beyond the subject matter. In these moments, she felt special, as though he saw more in her than she saw in herself. Before long, Jenny was seeking more ways to spend time with him. She requested additional meetings and eventually found an excuse to visit him in his office. What began as a brief meeting developed into longer conversations that were no longer just about class. They spoke about their futures, goals, and life. The discussions grew more personal, and Jenny realized she was drawn to him in a way she couldn't explain. It didn't take long for these conversations to become a regular part of her life. Her interactions with Mr. Harris gave her a sense of validation and opened up a new perspective on the world. The more time they spent together, the more her admiration for him grew. Jenny told her best friend Laura about the conversations she was increasingly having with Mr. Harris. She explained how much she looked forward to these meetings and how much they meant to her. It wasn't just the lessons that fascinated her, but also the way he understood her and encouraged her to think about her goals. Laura listened attentively, but her expression revealed a growing concern. She cautioned Jenny to be careful. A teacher-student relationship could easily become problematic, especially when the boundaries between teacher and student became blurred. She warned her not to get involved in something she might regret later. Jenny was initially irritated by Laura's concern and almost felt offended. She thought Laura didn't understand how important these conversations were to her, but deep down, doubts began to creep in. Maybe there was something she hadn't fully grasped yet, but the validation she received from Mr. Harris felt so good that she pushed Laura's warning aside for the time being. After Jenny and Mr. Harris had had many conversations, their meetings at school began to feel like a regular ritual. Jenny looked forward to the moment when class was over and she could talk to him for a short while. It wasn't just the lessons that fascinated her, but the deep discussions that went far beyond the classroom. One day, Mr. Harris suggested meeting outside of school. He mentioned that there were many interesting materials and books they could look at together to deepen their conversations. Jenny agreed. It was the perfect opportunity to learn more and strengthen their connection. They arranged to meet at the city library, a quiet place where they could talk uninterrupted. On the agreed day, Jenny entered the library and looked for him. Mr. Harris had already found a table in a secluded corner, surrounded by shelves of old, dusty books. The room was quiet, with only the soft rustle of pages breaking the silence. Mr. Harris greeted her warmly and invited her to sit down. He had brought several books that he thought would dive deeper into the topics they had been discussing. The meeting started like any other conversation, but the atmosphere was different. The isolation of the library and the closeness to him made Jenny feel a new, unfamiliar tension. It was as if the space between them had suddenly become smaller, as if their conversations meant more than she had ever imagined. As they continued looking through the books, Jenny noticed how often her thoughts lingered on Mr. Harris. It was more than just academic interest. Even though she tried to focus on the conversation, she felt a new kind of attraction that she couldn't deny. What had initially been purely intellectual began to evolve into something much more complex. It was a quiet Sunday when Jenny was first invited to Mr. Harris's house. After weeks of discussing the books he had shown her at the library, he invited her to look at more works he kept at home. Jenny, having no other plans for the day, agreed. When she rang his doorbell, he opened it warmly and led her into the living room, which was simply but cozy. They sat down on the couch, and he pulled out a few books he wanted to show her. Their conversation continued, but it was becoming less academic and increasingly focused on personal topics. The atmosphere was calm, almost intimate. It felt as if the hours passed slowly, and the space around them grew tighter. Jenny felt a growing attraction as she sat next to him. The way he looked at her, and the conversations, which were becoming less formal, created a tension she could no longer ignore. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a gradual transition, one in which the boundary between them blurred more and more. Eventually, as the evening went on and it grew late, Jenny decided it was time to say goodbye. But before she reached the door, Mr. Harris stepped toward her. It was a small gesture, but she could feel the change in the air. They stood facing each other, and in that moment it was clear. They had reached a point where there was no turning back. Soon after, they moved into his bedroom. It was a pivotal moment that would forever alter the dynamics of their relationship. What had started as academic interest had now veered into a dangerous direction. Jenny knew she had reached a turning point that she could no longer control. That same night, Jenny went to Laura's to tell her everything. They sat together in her room, and Jenny recounted everything that had happened. The meeting at Mr. Harris's house, the conversations, the hours they had spent together, and finally, the moment they ended up in his bedroom. Laura listened carefully, but the more Jenny spoke, the more serious her friend's expression became. Laura warned her to be careful, saying that this could not end well. She mentioned how dangerous it was to get involved in such a relationship, especially with someone like Mr. Harris, whom Jenny had respected so highly as a teacher. Jenny could hardly calm herself. She felt torn. On one hand, she had felt attracted to Mr. Harris, but on the other, she began to feel an increasing sense of discomfort as she thought about it. Jenny felt used and betrayed by someone she had always admired. She had placed her trust in an authority figure, only to realize that the relationship had been a mistake. It was as if she was more of a toy than a person who had truly been understood. In the days that followed, Jenny was hardly seen at school. She withdrew further, responding briefly and distantly to messages from Mr. Harris and avoiding speaking to him. Her thoughts constantly revolved around what had happened. The guilt gnawed at her, but she knew she had to take action to end the situation. After a week of reflection, Jenny made a decision. She had had enough time to clear her mind. She wanted it all to end. She arranged another meeting with Mr. Harris, but this time it would be different. She wanted to make it clear to him that what had happened was a one-time mistake. There would be no further relationship, either personal or professional. Even the after-class conversations, which she had initially found so exciting, needed to come to an end. She knew it would be a difficult confrontation, but she was determined to regain control and end everything. Jenny and Mr. Harris had arranged to meet in the school's office that evening, once everyone else had left. After weeks of intense conversations and the uncomfortable feeling of being manipulated, she knew she had to end it once and for all. She had sent him a message asking for a conversation, and he had agreed to meet after school. Jenny was determined to share her decision and make it clear that she no longer wanted any kind of relationship. When she entered the empty office, Mr. Harris was already sitting behind his desk. The atmosphere was tense, and Jenny felt uneasy as she closed the door behind her. She sat down, and her nervousness grew as she prepared to tell him her decision. She calmly explained that she could not continue what had happened between them. She felt used and placed in an unbearable situation by someone she had respected. It was not a healthy connection, but one based on an imbalance of power and manipulation. She knew she needed to distance herself to protect herself. Mr. Harris initially responded in silence, but as Jenny continued, his expression grew tenser. He tried to ignore her words and pull her onto his side. He said she would regret it later and that she was too young to understand this decision. But Jenny felt the manipulation behind his words and remained steadfast. He offered to keep everything secret, but Jenny refused to be swayed. She was determined not to reverse her decision. The situation escalated when Mr. Harris suddenly stood up and moved closer to her. Jenny felt the tension in the room and knew she had to act before it was too late. With a firm voice, she told him that she would go to the principal if he continued to harass her. She was ready to risk everything to free herself from this unhealthy web, even if it meant jeopardizing her entire school career. The thought of taking control away from him gave her the courage to continue speaking, making it clear that she was not afraid to bring the truth to light. Mr. Harris's face immediately changed. It was as if her words had disarmed him. The anger that flashed in his eyes made Jenny pause for a moment. For an instant, he no longer appeared as the calm teacher, but as someone who could lose everything. In that moment, he acted impulsively. Out of nowhere, he grabbed an object from the desk and struck Jenny with it. She staggered and collapsed to the floor. The pain shot through her head, and she lost consciousness. When she regained her senses, she was dazed, and her thoughts were a blur. When Mr. Harris realized what had happened and saw that Jenny was motionless on the floor, panic swept over him. In a moment of utter confusion, he decided to move her out of the room, hoping that would give him control over the situation. He dragged her into the hallway of the school and left her there before quickly leaving the room and exiting the school building. The pressure of the situation clouded his judgment, and he ran off without any plan or idea of what should happen next. The next morning, the cleaning staff found Jenny in the hallway. At first, they assumed she had simply passed out, but when they tried to wake her, it quickly became clear that something much more serious had happened. They immediately alerted the police. The investigators came across Mr. Harris when they learned from Laura that she had planned to meet with Jenny in his office the day before. Laura told the police that Jenny and Mr. Harris had developed a close relationship and that Jenny had mentioned the frequent meetings to her. The day after the incident, Mr. Harris had not shown up at school, which made the investigators suspicious. They began searching Mr. Harris' office and quickly found important clues that advanced the investigation. Among the items they discovered was the weapon, a heavy object that appeared to have been used in the violent confrontation. The police then continued their search for Mr. Harris and were eventually able to track him down at his home. He was arrested there and brought in for further questioning at the police station. The investigation now pointed to Mr. Harris being involved in the events that led to Jenny's death. It was a tragic end to a relationship that had started with manipulation and ended in violence. After the investigation was completed, Mr. Harris stood trial, where the tragedy took its final turn. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness testimonies and the discovery of the weapon in his office had clearly pointed to his role in Jenny's death. The police were able to establish that Mr. Harris and Jenny had shared a close relationship that ultimately escalated into violence. During the trial, Mr. Harris showed little remorse and tried to justify his actions with a series of excuses. But the facts spoke for themselves. The court convicted him of manslaughter, as it was a violent confrontation that had escalated due to his actions. The verdict was 25 years in prison without the possibility of early release. Jenny's family was devastated by the loss, stating that nothing could bring back their daughter's life. However, the verdict at least gave them a sense of justice. Mr. Harris's life was destroyed by his own actions. A man who had once been regarded as a respected teacher now faced the consequence of his behavior for the rest of his life. The tragedy, which caused so much pain and loss, remained a grim reminder of what happens when a relationship descends into the abyss. After the verdict, a tense silence hung over the community. People were shocked that such a tragedy could occur in their midst. Jenny was a young woman with so much ahead of her. Her life was cut short in a horrific way. The students who had known her were left stunned, and many wondered how a teacher, someone they were supposed to trust, could be capable of such a crime. For Laura, the loss of her best friend was a heavy blow. She had always tried to warn Jenny about the dangerous aspects of her relationship with Mr. Harris, but now it was too late. The pain of not being able to save her friend stayed with her. The memory of the vibrant young woman she had known, and the tragic events that led to her death, haunted her every day. Mr. Harris's life was also shattered. From a respected teacher to a convicted criminal, he lost not only his freedom, but any remaining reputation. The guilt he carried would haunt him for the rest of his life. Yet despite the verdict and the punishment, one question remained unanswered. How could it have come to this? How could a seemingly harmless relationship evolve into such a crime? This was the tragic story of Jenny and Mr. Harris, a case that shows how quickly trust can turn into manipulation and violence. It remains a sobering example of how dangerous it can be to lose oneself in a relationship where power and control play a role. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story with us. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss any more shocking cases on our channel. Until next time on Real Crime Reports, where we continue to shine a light on the darker sides of human nature.